Hello, everyone. Wishing you a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a heartbreaking and intense story. What would you do if you had to choose between your freedom and the life of the person who saved you? If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The silence stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. Tieu stood frozen, her hands still gripping the wooden handle of the door. Just inches away on the other side, someone was there. She could feel it, like a presence pressing through the thin wood, heavy and patient. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Behind her, CEO Quan forced himself to sit up straighter, despite the weakness in his body. His eyes were no longer clouded by fever. They were sharp now, focused, alert. "Step back," he said, his voice low but firm. Tieu hesitated. Another faint sound came from outside, a slow scrape, like fingers brushing against the wood. That was enough. She quickly released the handle and stepped back, her breath unsteady. CEO Quan swung his legs off the bed, ignoring the way his body protested. The moment his feet touched the ground, a wave of dizziness hit him. But he didn't show it. Not now. Not when danger was at the door. "Stay behind me," he said. Tieu eyes widened. "You're still sick." "I said stay behind me." This time there was no room for argument. She swallowed and nodded. Step by step, CEO Quan moved toward the door. Each movement was controlled, deliberate, even though his strength hadn't fully returned. His hand reached for the nearby wooden stick leaning against the wall, a simple farm tool, but right now it was the only thing he could use. The house was completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. Only the presence outside. CEO Quan stopped just short of the door. His grip tightened around the stick. Then he spoke. "Who's there?" No answer. Tieu held her breath. Seconds passed. Too long. Then suddenly, a knock. Slow, deliberate. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. Tieu flinched. That sound didn't feel like someone asking to come in. It felt like a warning. CEO Quan didn't move. "Leave," he said coldly, "or I call the police." Silence again. Then a voice, low, rough, almost amused. "You've got someone valuable in there." Tieu entire body went cold. She recognized nothing about that voice, but somehow it felt like it knew her. CEO Quan's expression darkened. "You have 10 seconds to leave." A quiet chuckle came from outside. "10 seconds," the man repeated. "You should be the one counting." Tieu grabbed the edge of CEO Quan's shirt unconsciously, her fingers trembling. Something was wrong, very wrong. The man outside wasn't afraid, not even a little. And that meant he wasn't alone. CEO Quan seemed to realize it at the same time. His eyes flicked toward the window. Then, a shadow moved, not at the door, but outside the window. Tieu gasped softly. "There's more than one," she whispered. Before CEO Quan could respond, a loud bang hit the side wall. Both of them flinched. Another hit followed, stronger. The wooden house trembled slightly. "They're trying to break in," Tieu said, panic rising. CEO Quan didn't answer. His mind was already moving. Fast. Too fast for his weakened body. But he forced it anyway. "We can't stay here," he said. Tieu heart dropped. "Then what do we do?" CEO Quan glanced toward the back of the house. "There's a rear exit." Another bang shook the wall. Dust fell from the wooden beams above. "They won't take long," he added. Tieu nodded quickly, fear pushing her forward. Okay. CEO Quan grabbed her wrist gently but firmly. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens, don't let go." She nodded again. "I won't." Without wasting another second, he led her toward the back of the house. Every step felt louder than it should, every creak of the wooden floor echoing like it might give them away. Behind them, another crash. This time part of the door frame cracked. They were running out of time. Tieu Lac's breathing grew uneven. Her mind raced. Who were they? Why were they here? Was it because of her? The moment that thought hit, her stomach dropped. The memory from the market, the eyes, the feeling of being watched, it all came crashing back. They're here because of me, she whispered. CEO Quan tightened his grip on her wrist. Don't think about that now. But it was already too late. Tieu Lac's chest felt tight because deep down, she knew it was true. They reached the back door. CEO Quan paused for just a second, listening. No sound, no movement. He slowly pushed the door open. The outside looked clear, but neither of them felt safe. Go, he said. Tieu Lac stepped out first, her feet hitting the soft dirt behind the house. The air felt colder, sharper. CEO Quan followed immediately, closing the door behind them as quietly as possible. For a brief moment, everything was still, too still. Then, a voice came from the left. So, you chose to run. Tieu Lac's blood froze. They turned, and there he was, the man from the shadows, standing just a few meters away, watching them, smiling. And in that moment, Tieu Lac realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a random attack. He knew exactly where she would go. He had been waiting for her. The man stepped forward slowly. Each step was unhurried, confident, as if he already knew there was no way for them to escape. Tieu Lac's fingers tightened around CEO Quan's sleeve. Her body trembled, but her eyes were locked onto his face. Something inside her chest twisted painfully. That face. There was something familiar, not clear, not complete, but enough to make her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear alone. The man tilted his head slightly, studying her reaction. Then he smiled. You finally recognize something, don't you? Tieu Lac's breath caught. I don't know you, she whispered, though even she could hear the doubt in her own voice. The man let out a low chuckle. Of course you don't, he said. You weren't supposed to remember. CEO Quan stepped forward, placing himself fully in front of Tieu Lac. That's enough, he said coldly. Say what you want and leave. The man's gaze shifted to him, and for the first time, his smile faded. You're the one who took her. Not a question, a statement. CEO Quan didn't answer, but the silence was enough. The man's eyes darkened. Do you have any idea how much she's worth? He continued, his voice turning colder. Or did you just play the hero without thinking? Tieu Lac's heart dropped. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. The man looked back at her, and this time, there was no amusement left. Only something darker. You really don't remember, he said quietly. Then, he took another step closer. You were sold. The words hit like a blade. Tieu Lac froze. Her mind went blank. What? You were sold, he repeated, by someone you trusted. Her chest tightened. Fragments, broken pieces of something long buried. A dark room. Voices she couldn't understand. Fear. Hands grabbing her. A door closing. No! She shook her head weakly. That's not true. But her voice was breaking, because somewhere deep inside, something was waking up. CEO Quan spoke sharply, cutting through the moment. Stop talking. His voice was no longer just cold. It was dangerous. The man smirked slightly. What? You don't want her to know? He said. Or are you afraid she'll remember everything? CEO Quan's grip tightened. Leave, now. The air grew heavy. For a second, it felt like everything might explode. Then, a sound came from behind. Footsteps. More than one. Tieu Lac turned. Two more men stepped out from behind the trees, blocking the path. Her heart sank. They were surrounded. The man in front spread his arms slightly. Now, he said, Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. CEO Quan moved instantly. He pulled Tieu Lạc behind him again. You're not taking her, he said. Simple, clear, final. The man sighed. I was hoping you'd say that. Then, everything happened at once. One of the men lunged forward. CEO Quan reacted immediately, swinging the wooden stick with precision. It struck the attacker's arm, forcing him back. But the impact sent a shock through CEO Quan's body. He staggered, just for a second. But it was enough. Another man rushed in from the side. Tieu Lạc screamed, "Watch out!" CEO Quan turned. Too late. The second man grabbed him, forcing him backward. The stick fell from his hand. Tieu Lac's heart stopped. CEO Quan! She ran forward instinctively, but a hand grabbed her arm. Hard, pain shot through her wrist. Got you, the man whispered near her ear. Tieu Lạc struggled immediately. Let me go! Her voice broke as panic surged through her. No! Let me go! She fought, kicked, twisted, but his grip was too strong. Across from her, CEO Quan forced the man holding him back with sheer will, his breathing heavy, his body shaking from both the fight and the lingering fever. Don't touch her, he roared. For the first time, his voice wasn't calm. It wasn't controlled. It was raw, furious. The man holding Tieu Lạc laughed. Too late. Tieu Lac's eyes filled with tears. CEO Quan. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything unspoken between them became clear. Fear, desperation, and something deeper. Something neither of them had ever said out loud. CEO Quan's voice dropped, low, steady. Don't be afraid. Even now, he was trying to protect her. Tieu Lạc shook her head, tears falling. I'm not afraid for me, she whispered. I'm afraid for you. That sentence hit harder than anything else. CEO Quan froze, just for a second, and that second cost him. The man behind him tightened his hold. Another blow landed. CEO Quan dropped to one knee. CEO Quan! Tieu Lạc screamed. The man in front stepped closer, watching calmly. Enough, he said. Everything stopped. The attackers stepped back slightly, but still held their positions. The man looked at Tieu Lạc, then at CEO Quan, then back at her again. You have two choices, he said. Tieu Lac's breath shook. What? You come with us willingly, he said, and he lives. Her heart shattered. And if I don't? The man's eyes were cold. Then he dies here. Silence. Absolute silence. Tieu Lạc looked at CEO Quan. He shook his head immediately. No, he said. Don't listen to him. But his voice was weaker now. Tieu Lac's tears fell faster. Her chest hurt so much she could barely breathe. This was it, a choice she never wanted to face. Her freedom or his life. The man waited, patient, certain, because he already believed he knew her answer. Tieu Lạc closed her eyes just for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were no longer filled with panic, but with something else, something steady. I'll go with you. No! CEO Quan shouted, but it was too late. Tieu Lạc looked at him one last time. A faint, trembling smile touched her lips. Thank you for saving my life, she said softly, and I'm sorry. I can't stay. Her words felt like a goodbye. The man smiled. Smart choice. He signaled the others. The grip on CEO Quan loosened, but his body collapsed forward, too weak to stand. Tieu Lạc, don't go, he said, his voice breaking for the first time. She didn't turn back, because if she did, she wouldn't be able to leave. Step by step, she walked toward the man, toward the darkness, toward the past she had tried to escape. And as she disappeared beyond the trees, only one thought remained in CEO Quan's mind. Not fear, not anger, but a single burning promise. No matter what it takes, he will bring her back. As danger closes in, Tieu Lạc and CEO Quan attempt to escape through the back of the house, only to find themselves surrounded. The mysterious man reveals a shocking truth. Tieu Lạc was once sold, and her past is now coming back to claim her. As fragments of memory begin to surface, fear and confusion overwhelm her. Despite his weakened condition, CEO Quan fights desperately to protect her, but he is outnumbered. When the attackers gain control, Tieu Lạc is forced into an impossible choice: her freedom or CEO Quan's life. Refusing to let him die, she makes a heartbreaking decision to go with them. As she walks away into the unknown, leaving him behind, CEO Quan collapses. But in his heart, a powerful promise is born. No matter what it takes, he will find her and bring her back.